We're getting first word of casualties in Egypt as thousands brave tear gas to demand a change at the very top. In with the largest public outcry for democratic reform in Egypt in decades, some say ever. Young and old, Christians and Muslims, students and professionals all came together for protests inspired by Tunisia's recent popular revolt. Demonstrators want to seize on the momentum for change, a moment in history they don't want to let slip by. The tens of thousands in Cairo and other cities demanded the ouster of longtime President Hosni Mubarak. Many are fed up with poverty, corruption and life under Egypt's emergency law, which limits freedoms and allows police to arrest people without charge. And some protesters threw stones at riot police who fired back with tear gas and water cannon. In the past, fears of police retaliation have largely kept a lid on these kinds of protests, but not today. Our own Ben Wiedemann was right in the thick of it. He called the demonstrations unbelievable, like nothing he's ever seen in all his years covering the country. And he joins us now live from Cairo with more. Ben?
Yes, Becky, this really shocked everybody. The press, the protesters, nobody really imagined that they would get this big. In fact, I had that moment of realization. We were driving in a taxi underneath one of the bridges that comes across the Nile, and I looked up, and the bridge was full of thousands of people, mostly students, crossing over into the heart of Cairo. They joined other protesters in Tahrir Square, which is the main square. There were well over 10,000 people there, all of them calling, as you said, for the ouster of the government of President Hosni Mubarak, in power since 1981. We saw as they clashed with the police just 2 blocks from the Egyptian parliament, protesters throwing rocks, the police throwing rocks back, and then starting to fire with some very strong tear gas. Now, even now, and it is 11 o'clock at night in Cairo, there are still thousands of people in that main square saying that they're going to continue to protest until their demands are met. But what's really interesting is that these protests have had no religious overtone. We've seen Muslims and Christians, farmers and students, office workers, factory workers, men and women, all sorts of people joining in this demonstration, which has got to be the biggest one many of us have ever seen in Egypt. Becky?
Ben, social media reportedly playing a part in galvanizing support for today's protests. On Twitter, for example, the Egypt protests are one of the most popular topics, and people are using the hashtag @Jan25 and @Egypt to communicate with each other. Is it clear how significant a role the online world has played in rallying people onto the streets today?
Becky, the online activism has always been an interesting part of Egypt, but until now we would tend to see a lot of online activism that never really got translated into street action. And today, though, I think they've really crossed that Rubicon. What we've seen is that this demonstration was indeed organized by 2 online groups working together that spread the word, as you said, through Facebook, with one of those Facebook groups getting more than 300,000 followers. And it spread also by word of mouth, by SMSs, so that, you know, we were really expecting little small pockets of demonstrations, 200 or 300 apiece. So when I saw thousands of people pouring into the heart of Cairo, I realized that this was not your run-of-the-mill demonstration. And clearly, Twitter, Facebook, SMS played a huge role in helping organize it. Becky?
Ben, you've been recently in Tunisia covering what has become known as the Jasmine Revolution. How does what you've seen on the streets and what you're hearing in Cairo compare to what you heard and saw in Tunis?
Well, you know, I worked in Tunisia during the time of the old regime of Zayn al-Abidin Ben Ali, and it was a much more repressive regime than the one in Egypt. You know, there you really couldn't talk in public about politics. The press was very strictly controlled. Here you have a much more liberal press. Egyptians are free to say whatever they want. The line is drawn when they start doing what they want, when they start holding demonstrations. So there's a big difference. On the other hand, you do have many of the same ills of society, so to speak, in Egypt that existed in Tunisia. You have a declining economy, you have a rising cost of living, you have a lot of corruption within the government, and of course you have a president who's been in office for longer than most Egyptians have been alive. So there are important differences, but important similarities as well. Becky?
Ben Wiedemann reporting from Cairo. Ben, thank you for that. Egypt's foreign ministry spokesman said it's important to put these protests in perspective. He says the demonstrators represent only a fraction of Cairo's population, and he says it's telling that they were even allowed to openly protest against the government.
This country has known freedoms much unprecedented in this region, in Arab countries at least. This is something that has not been seen. Protesters being protected in the street, not being harassed, not being killed in the streets like we have seen recently by other regimes. This is a totally different situation. So we have to put things in perspective and not allow overzealots to qualify the situation by things that it is not. So we have to be very careful here.
And let me just qualify what was said there after that interview. In fact, reports that one protester has died and another policeman has died to date in those protests. Well, the United States, an ally of the Egyptian government, says it believes the country is stable despite the unrest. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton sounded confident today in Egypt's ability to address the people's grievances. This is what she said.
We support the fundamental right of expression and assembly for all people, and we urge that all parties exercise restraint and refrain from violence. But our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable and is looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs and interests of the Egyptian people.
Well, one of Egypt's top opposition leaders takes issue with Hillary Clinton's remark that the Egyptian government is stable. I talked earlier with Mohammed El Baradei, a former head of the UN's nuclear watchdog, who is now at the forefront of a push for political change in his country.
I was stunned to hear, Secretary Clinton saying that the Egyptian government is stable, and I ask myself, at what price is stability? Is it on the basis of 29 years of martial law? Is it on the basis of 30 years of ossified regime? Is it on the basis of rigged election? That's not stability. That is living on a borrowed time. Stability is when you have a government that is elected on a free and fair basis, and we have seen, how election has been rigged in Egypt. We have seen how people have been tortured, and when you see today almost over 100,000 young people getting desperate, going to the street, asking for their basic freedoms, I expected to hear from Secretary Clinton stuff like, democracy, human rights, basic freedoms, all the stuff the UN is standing for.
I want to just show our viewers a tweet from you from a couple of days ago, and I quote, "Threats of violence against participants in peaceful demonstrations reveal the ugly face of a regime terrified of its own people." Mohammed, you've been encouraging people to take to the streets. Why?
Because I've been, Becky, trying for a year to engage the regime through peaceful means by collecting signature on demands for free and fair election, for opening the door for Egyptians to run for presidency, for having parliament that representative of the people. When you have a parliament right now that have opposition of 3%, you are really insulting the intelligence of the people by trying to say this is a democratic system.
I wonder whether it's responsible to encourage people to take to the streets in protest that could turn deadly, and also wonder why you haven't, Mohammed, taken part.
Well, I didn't ask for people to take to the street, Becky. This was completely initiated by the young people. I haven't taken part because, we have to have division of labor. I can't get access to the media while I'm in Egypt. I'm completely blocked from getting access to the media, and I think it's important for me to continue to speak about the plight of the Egyptian people, and unfortunately I have to get out of Egypt to be able to speak about the plight of the Egyptians.
Mohammed, let me bring up a Facebook site here, El Baradei for Presidency of Egypt. There are more than 200,000 Facebook fans there, which begs the question, will you run for president?
Becky, the priority for me is to shift Egypt into a democracy, is to catch up with the 21st century, to get Egypt to be a modern and moderate society, and respecting human rights, respecting the basic freedom of the people. Whether I run or not, that is totally irrelevant. And I made it very clear I will not run under the present condition when the deck is stacked completely.
Mohammed, was the Jasmine revolution that we've seen in Tunisia just the start of things to come in the region?
It sent a message everywhere to the Arab world, Becky, that, to quote Barack Obama, yes, we can. That it is doable. Then that we can be empowered as people to change a system that is ossified, that is completely repressive of our own basic rights.
Do you fear for your own safety at this point?
Well, that's a good question. There was an edict against me, a couple of weeks ago, basically saying that my life should be dispensable because I'm defying the ruler. So I have no security when I go to Egypt. I'm going to Egypt in the next few days, and this is a good question, Becky. But you have to be with your people.
Mohammed El Baradei speaking to me earlier from Vienna.